So, what if I told you that, according to one pretty provocative legal theory, the U.S. Constitution hasn't really been in charge for almost a century? Today, we're going to unpack a document called the Presumption Killer. And trust me, it makes a claim so big, it could completely change how you see the U.S. government.
The whole theory really boils down to this one jarring question. The source we're looking at basically says yes. It argues that since 1933, the United States hasn't been run by the Constitution we all learn about, but by a system of permanent emergency powers. I know, it's a huge claim, so let's break down exactly how they make their case.
All right, so to really get our heads around this, we're going to follow the source's logic through 6 key steps. We'll start with what most of us believe is true about the government. Then we'll zero in on a critical moment back in 1933, look at what the source calls a smoking gun admission from Congress, and see how it all leads to the final wild conclusion that the Constitution has been completely bypassed.
Okay, first up, the entire argument kicks off by challenging something it calls the constitutional presumption. Think of this as the foundational belief, the very first domino that this theory is about to topple.
You know, we all learned this in civics class, right? You've got your 3 branches of government: legislative, executive, judicial, and they all have their own separate powers. It's the bedrock of the whole system. But this is where the theory lands its first big punch. It claims that this core belief is, and I'm quoting them directly here, factually and legally false. Wow.
So if our basic understanding is wrong, where did things supposedly go off the rails? Well, the source points to one single moment in history, all the way back to 1933, right in the middle of the Great Depression.
The story starts back in 1917 with a law called the Trading with the Enemy Act. And just like the name says, it gave the president certain powers, but only during a time of war. Pretty clear. But then, on March 9, 1933, Congress passed the Emergency Banking Act, and that new law made a tiny little change to the old one, adding one crucial phrase that, according to this theory, changed everything.
And right there, that's the change. With just a few extra words, these massive powers that were once locked away for wartime could now be flipped on by the president, anytime. All he had to do was declare a national emergency. The source claims this was the moment the whole system got rewired. It's like a secret switch was installed in the government.
So, for 40 years, this emergency system was supposedly running in the background. But then we get to 1973, and this is where the source presents its smoking gun. It claims that Congress itself decided to investigate this whole situation and ended up making a truly shocking admission.
Just listen to this. This is a direct quote from that Senate report in 1973. Let it sink in. A U.S. Senate committee concluded that these emergency statutes gave the president enough power to rule the country without reference to normal constitutional processes. I mean, that's not some blogger saying that, that's Congress.
And we are not talking about some minor powers here. That same committee found 470 separate federal laws that could be switched on instantly. And think about the year, 1973. This is right in the thick of the Watergate scandal. Congress was already on high alert about presidential power, and even they were stunned to find this huge arsenal of emergency powers just sitting on the books.
Okay, so what's the actual consequence of all this? What does it mean to live under a permanent state of emergency? Well, according to the source, the result is the modern administrative state. That whole alphabet soup of federal agencies that make rules about, well, everything.
Now, the whole point of the Constitution is separating powers, right? Congress makes rules, the president enforces them, the courts judge them. But the source argues that in the administrative state, that all gets thrown into a blender. A single agency can often write the rules, then act as the police to enforce them, and then act as the judge in its own little court. That's all 3 powers of government rolled into one.
And this is the absolute linchpin of the whole theory. The source claims that this mashing together of powers is only possible because of that emergency framework. It draws a straight line from the huge administrative state we have today all the way back to that one little change in the law from 1933.
So this raises a pretty big question. If this whole system is so unconstitutional, why haven't the courts, especially the Supreme Court, jumped in and stopped it? Well, the source has a very specific theory about why the courts have been so quiet.
Yeah, it's the elephant in the room, isn't it? If the system is as broken as this theory claims, why doesn't the one branch of government designed to be the referee blow the whistle?
The source's answer is something it calls a jurisdictional trap. Here's how it's supposed to work. A massive amount of the federal court's power and their daily business comes from enforcing these very administrative and emergency laws. So if they were to rule the whole system unconstitutional, it would be like a judge sawing off the branch they're sitting on. They'd be getting rid of their own authority. So the theory goes, they just don't. They avoid the big fundamental question, a strategy the source calls non-adjudication.
And all of that brings us to the final, really radical conclusion of the Presumption Killer document, where all these different pieces finally come together.
So here's the bottom line, according to the source. It's a three-part conclusion. First, all governance based on these declared emergencies is flat out illegal. Second, the entire system of administrative law is unconstitutional. And third, the courts are trapped. They can't fix it because they'd be ruling against the very system that gives them so much of their power.
And this one quote really sums up the entire idea perfectly. The argument isn't that the Constitution was just interpreted differently or that it slowly eroded. It's that an entirely separate system was switched on back in 1933, creating a parallel track that just bypasses the Constitution we all thought was in charge.
And so after all that, we're left with one final and pretty unsettling question to chew on. If this theory has any truth to it, if the Constitution really has been bypassed, then what do we call the system that's been running the country in its place for nearly a century?